On a warm Sunday morning in December 1941, the battleship USS Arizona rested quietly along Battleship Row in Pearl Harbor. Below deck, sailors slept, dressed, ate breakfast, and prepared for another ordinary day in paradise. At 8:10 in the morning, a single armor-piercing bomb, converted from a 16-inch battleship shell, penetrated deep into the ship and set off the forward magazines. In seconds, the ship became a furnace. The blast shattered her forward hull. The ship lifted under the force of the explosion and quickly settled to the bottom of the harbor. Of the 2,403 Americans killed at Pearl Harbor that morning, 1,177 died aboard the Arizona. Their names are carved today in white marble above the wreck that became the final resting place of more than 900 of them. Oil still rises from the ship, one dark drop at a time, more than 80 years later. Visitors often call them the black tears of the Arizona, the tears of the fallen. Most Americans know what happened that morning. What is harder and far more disturbing is understanding why it happened. The admiral, who became the attack's chief architect, had warned that Japan could not survive a long war with the United States. Yet, when war appeared unavoidable, he became the most determined advocate of the blow that would begin it. President Roosevelt authorized economic pressure intended to halt Japanese expansion. In practice, those measures became a near-total cutoff of the oil Japan needed to keep its empire moving. Japanese diplomats continued speaking of peace in Washington, even as 6 Japanese aircraft carriers crossed the northern Pacific under strict radio silence. And 10 days before the attack, a senior State Department advisor wrote an official memorandum saying he would give 5-to-1 odds that America and Japan would not be at war before December 15. He was wrong by 8 days. This was not a war created by one stubborn diplomat, one accidental decision, or one cruel general. It grew from Japanese imperial ambition, Western racism and economic pressure, failed diplomacy, and catastrophic miscalculations on both sides. But the final decision to launch the war was made in Tokyo. And if you had a father, a grandfather, or an uncle who wore the uniform between 1941 and 1945, then this story belongs to your family, whether they ever spoke of it or not. This is the real road to Pearl Harbor. 230 miles north of the Hawaiian Islands, the Pacific Ocean churned black beneath a sky that had not yet decided whether to become dawn. 6 aircraft carriers sliced through the water in absolute silence. No radio signals, no running lights, only the low, mechanical breath of engines and the steady vibration of steel plates humming beneath thousands of sailors. On the flight deck of the flagship Akagi, young pilots prepared their aircraft in the pale gray light. They had trained for this moment for months. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, 54 years old, a career naval officer, raised his hand. Across the 6 carriers, hundreds of aircraft had been assigned to 2 attack waves. 353 would take part in the assault on Oahu. Zeros, Vols, Kates, each one loaded with torpedoes, bombs, and the fate of an empire. He gave the order. The engines roared to life. One after another, the aircraft lifted from the decks into the pale gray light, forming a swarm that darkened the sky above the Pacific. They turned south, toward Pearl Harbor, toward a sleeping American fleet, toward a war that would kill more than 50 million people before it was done. But to understand why 353 Japanese aircraft appeared over Hawaii on that Sunday morning, we cannot begin in 1941. We must go back further, almost 90 years further, to another fleet in another harbor carrying a very different flag. Because the story of Pearl Harbor does not begin with Japan attacking America. It begins with American warships forcing Japan to open its doors under the shadow of their guns. The year was 1853. The place was Edo Bay, the principal harbor of Japan, home to the shogun and the beating heart of a nation that had chosen, for more than 2 centuries, to seal most of itself off from the rest of the world. Japan was not completely closed. A few tightly controlled channels remained open. Dutch and Chinese merchants traded at Nagasaki. Relations with Korea passed through the island of Tsushima. Western knowledge trickled in through the Dutch, but for ordinary Japanese, the world beyond the horizon was forbidden. Any citizen caught leaving the islands was executed upon return, and any foreign power that came uninvited would meet soldiers and cannon. And then, on the morning of July 8, 1853, the sky changed. Fishermen along the coast looked up and saw something they could not comprehend. Black-hulled warships, some driven by steam, pouring smoke into the sky above vessels that could move without sails. The Japanese called them Kurofun, the Black Ships. At their command stood Commodore Matthew Calbraith Perry of the United States Navy, a stern man with the confidence of a nation that had already decided the future belonged to it. Perry had been sent by President Millard Fillmore with a clear mission: establish formal relations, secure ports where American ships could obtain fuel and supplies, protect shipwrecked sailors, and open the door to future trade. Under the threat of overwhelming force, Perry did not ask. Perry demanded. He anchored his squadron in Edo Bay, refused to leave when ordered, and delivered a letter to the Japanese authorities. The diplomatic language was formal. The threat behind it was not. Japan could open its ports voluntarily or face the possibility of force. Japan's wooden warships and coastal guns could not match Perry's modern steam-powered squadron. The gap was not a difference of degree. It was a difference of centuries. On March 31, 1854, Japan signed the Treaty of Kanagawa. It opened 2 ports to American ships for supplies and established a permanent American consular presence. Broader commercial privileges and more serious losses of Japanese legal autonomy would follow 4 years later, in the Harris Treaty of 1858. The Black Ships had come, and they had left behind a wound that would echo through the next 90 years of Japanese history. The humiliation left a deep mark on many Japanese leaders and intellectuals. How did we let this happen? And how do we make sure it never happens again? Across the Sea of Japan, the answer was written in blood. In China, the British Empire had discovered that opium, grown in India, could be sold for enormous profits. When the Chinese government tried to stop the trade, Britain went to war. Twice, and twice, China lost. By the 1860s, the greatest civilization in Asia was being carved apart. Hong Kong was handed to the British. Ports were opened at gunpoint. Russian armies pushed into the north, seizing thousands of miles of coastline along the Pacific. The Chinese called this period the century of humiliation. The Japanese watched, and the Japanese learned. They saw what happened to nations that could not defend themselves, and they made a decision that would change the course of history. They would not become China, they would become something else. In 1868, a revolution swept through Japan. The last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, returned governing authority to the young emperor, hoping to avoid national ruin. But the transition did not remain peaceful. Within months, Japan was fighting the Boshin Civil War. It would not end until the following year, after thousands lay dead across the northern islands. At the center of the new order stood Mutsuhito, the teenage emperor who had ascended the throne in 1867. History would remember him as Emperor Meiji. Around him gathered a generation of reformers who understood exactly what they wanted to build. A Japan that would never again see foreign warships appear in its harbors uninvited. A Japan that could stand as an equal beside Britain, France, and the United States. And to build that Japan, they would have to become the very thing that had humiliated them. The transformation was staggering. The capital was moved from Kyoto to Edo, and Edo was renamed Tokyo. Delegations were sent across the world to study everything. The most famous of these was the Iwakura mission, which departed in 1871. More than 100 officials, staff members, and students. 12 countries. They met Queen Victoria in London. They met President Ulysses S. Grant in Washington. They studied German constitutions, French legal codes, British navies, and American factories. And when they returned, they carried with them a single revolutionary conclusion. Technology alone was not enough. The true source of Western power lay in institutions, in systems, in education, in law. Japan would have to rebuild itself from the foundation up, and so it did. Elementary education was made compulsory. The University of Tokyo was founded, later becoming Tokyo Imperial University. A modern constitution was drafted. A parliament was established. A central bank was created. In the heart of Tokyo, a business district rose from the earth, its red brick buildings so distinctly Western that visitors nicknamed it Little London. A nation shaped by centuries of feudal rule became, within a single district, an industrial power. But something was missing. The Meiji reformers had noticed one final truth about the great powers of the world. Every one of them had an empire: Britain, France, the Netherlands, Russia. Even the young United States was building an empire, seizing Hawaii, seizing the Philippines, seizing Guam. If Japan was to be a great power, Japan too would need an empire. Many former samurai found a new role in the officer corps and bureaucracy of the modern state, while a conscript army replaced the old feudal forces. The military was rebuilt on the Prussian model. The navy was rebuilt on the British model. By the end of the 19th century, Japan possessed a professional officer corps and a modern fleet. The nation that Perry had humiliated in 1853 was, by 1900, ready to humiliate others. And there was one more thing: religion. The reformers reached back into ancient Shinto belief and elevated it to the center of national life. The state presented the emperor as sacred and descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. Schools and military institutions cultivated obedience and sacrifice, ideas that would become increasingly extreme in the decades ahead. In 1926, when Emperor Meiji's grandson ascended to that throne, he inherited this system in full. His name was Hirohito. He was 25 years old, quiet, thoughtful, a lover of marine biology. But he was born into the role of a living god, and the empire his grandfather had built now expected him to lead it. Somewhere in the naval academies of this rising empire, another young man was learning his craft, a short, compact officer with dark eyes. In 1905, at the age of 21, he stood aboard a Japanese warship during the greatest naval battle Asia had ever seen. Shells screamed through the air. A blast tore the index and middle fingers from his left hand. He survived. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto, and 36 years later, from his flagship Nagato in Japanese waters, he would wait for news as Nagumo's carriers launched the attack he had helped design. The wind off the Sea of Japan was cold on the morning of May 27, 1905. Yamamoto stood on the deck of the cruiser Nishin, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Somewhere out there in the mist, the Russian Baltic Fleet was steaming into the Tsushima Strait. 38 warships, the pride of a European empire. They had sailed 18,000 miles around the coast of Africa to crush the Japanese navy. They would not succeed. Under the command of Admiral Togo Haihachiro, the Japanese fleet executed one of the most decisive naval maneuvers in the history of warfare. In less than 24 hours, the Russian fleet ceased to exist. 21 Russian ships sank beneath the waves. Nearly 5,000 Russian sailors died. Only 3 Russian ships escaped to safety. Tsushima became part of the professional memory of Yamamoto's generation, a demonstration that one decisive naval victory could alter the fate of nations. The victory changed everything. For the first time in the modern age, an Asian power had defeated a European empire in open battle. Japan gained southern Sakhalin, Russia's leasehold rights at Port Arthur, and control of the southern branch of the Manchurian Railway. Among military officers and nationalist thinkers, a dangerous conviction began to grow. If Japan could defeat Russia, perhaps no enemy was beyond its reach. Then came the First World War. Japan sided with the Allies. It cost them very little. And when the war ended, they walked away with German colonies in China and across the Central Pacific, an empire delivered without significant sacrifice. At the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, Japan sent delegates who tried to insert a single clause into the new League of Nations Charter, a racial equality clause, a statement that all peoples, regardless of color, deserved equal treatment. 11 of the 16 delegates present supported the proposal, a majority. But President Woodrow Wilson, serving as chairman of the commission, ruled that such a measure required unanimity. Australia opposed it fiercely. Britain would not force the issue, and the clause died despite winning a majority of the vote. To many in Japan, the message seemed brutally clear. Even when Japan won a majority, racial equality could still be denied. 5 years later, in 1924, the United States Congress passed the Immigration Act, which effectively barred new Japanese immigration to the United States, placing Japan within a racial exclusion system that caused deep resentment. In the streets of Tokyo, ordinary people gathered outside the American embassy. Some wept, some burned American flags. The wound of the black ships had never healed. Now salt had been poured into it. Then came 1929. The New York Stock Exchange collapsed. American stock prices fell catastrophically over the next 3 years. The Great Depression swept across the world like a cold, killing wind. Japan was hit hard, especially in rural districts dependent on silk exports. The collapse of the American market devastated Japan's silk industry, destroying rural incomes with terrifying speed. In the villages of northern Japan, families began selling their daughters into brothels simply to eat, and in this moment of national despair, the military stepped forward with a promise. Give us your trust, and we will take from Asia what the West has denied us: land, resources, markets, respect. The politicians who had guided Japan through the previous decade were pushed aside. Some were assassinated in their offices, some in their homes. One prime minister was shot dead by young naval officers. When the assassins stood trial, thousands of ordinary Japanese citizens signed petitions demanding their release. Some petitions were written in the signers' own blood. The rule of law was dying in Japan, and in its place a new god was rising: the god of conquest. On the night of September 18, 1931, a small explosion tore through a section of the South Manchuria Railway near the Chinese city of Mukden. The damage was minimal, but it did not matter because the explosion had not been set by Chinese rebels. It had been set by junior officers of Japan's own Kwantung Army. They had been waiting for their excuse. Within hours, Japanese forces were pouring across the Manchurian frontier. Within months, they had seized a territory larger than France and Germany combined. The Japanese government in Tokyo tried to order a halt. The Kwantung Army ignored them. The Prime Minister was forced to endorse a conquest he had never authorized, simply to save face. The tail was now wagging the dog. The League of Nations formally condemned Japan's actions. The Japanese delegate stood up in Geneva, gathered his papers, and walked out of the assembly hall. Japan withdrew from the League, but the League had only words, and words could not stop what was coming. On July 7, 1937, at a bridge outside Beijing named for Marco Polo, Japanese and Chinese soldiers exchanged fire in a confused nighttime skirmish. Within days, it had escalated into full-scale war. The Second Sino-Japanese War had begun. It would not end until 1945. By December of that first year, Japanese forces had captured Shanghai and marched toward the Chinese capital of Nanking. What happened there is one of the darkest chapters in human history. The post-war Tokyo Tribunal concluded that more than 200,000 civilians and prisoners of war were murdered in Nanking and its vicinity in the weeks that followed. Other estimates run higher, depending on the geographical and chronological boundaries used. Japanese newspapers even reported that 2 junior officers were competing to be the first to kill 100 Chinese with their swords, though historians continue to debate the exact circumstances behind those reports. Women and girls were raped in numbers that historians still struggle to count. The world watched in horror. American missionaries in Nanking smuggled out photographs and letters. Newsreels reached theaters in New York and Los Angeles. In American living rooms, ordinary people saw for the first time what the Japanese army had become. In Washington, attitudes hardened. Japan was increasingly seen not as a power to be accommodated, but as an aggressor whose expansion had to be resisted. The man who would lead that resistance was, on the surface, an unlikely warrior. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was 51 years old when he took office in 1933, confined to a wheelchair by polio since 1921. A man who had learned to hide his physical weakness behind an unbreakable smile and a voice that could reach into a radio and hold an entire nation in the palm of its hand. Roosevelt did not want war with Japan. No sane American leader did, but he watched Japanese ships taking on scrap iron and aviation fuel from American ports, then using that same metal and that same fuel to bomb Chinese cities. And he began cautiously to close the tap. In July 1940, Roosevelt gained authority to control strategic export. Aviation gasoline was restricted first. Broader limits on iron and steel scrap followed that autumn. Piece by piece, the flow of American materials to Japan was tightened. On September 27, 1940, in Berlin, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The pact pledged mutual assistance if one of its members were attacked by a power not already involved in the wars in Europe or China. It was designed partly as a warning to the United States, but it did not automatically require Germany to join a war that Japan started. That distinctions, obscure at the time, would matter enormously in the days after Pearl Harbor. Then came the summer of 1941. With France defeated by Germany and the Netherlands occupied, their Asian colonies stood defenseless. Japan looked south toward the rubber plantations of Indochina, the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the tin mines of Malaya, a treasure lying in the streets, as one Japanese officer put it, waiting to be picked up. After Vichy France yielded to Japanese demands for military bases in southern Indochina, Roosevelt signed an executive order on July 26, 1941, freezing all Japanese assets in the United States. Japanese forces moved into those bases immediately afterward. The freeze was implemented through a licensing system administered by several agencies, including the State Department, the Treasury Department, and a special Foreign Funds Control Committee. A small number of licenses were technically approved, but the financial controls and the licensing system prevented any meaningful resumption of oil shipments. Assistant Secretary of State Dean Acheson, 48 years old, a brilliant lawyer who favored a hard line against Japanese expansion, played a significant role in that hardening. Historians still debate whether the total cutoff that emerged precisely matched Roosevelt's initial intention, or how much discretion officials beneath him exercised. What is not debated is the result. By the fall of 1941, Japan's oil imports from the United States had ceased. Japan had, at current rates of consumption, perhaps 18 months of oil left. After that, its ships would stop moving, its planes would stop flying, its empire would collapse. The clock was now ticking, and the Japanese generals could hear every tick. In a series of cabinet meetings, liaison conferences, and imperial conferences that autumn, Japan's leaders debated how long diplomacy could continue while preparations for war accelerated. Withdrawal from China remained the concession the army was least willing to accept. If diplomacy failed, they intended to seize the resources they needed by force. The man who would lead the negotiations was Fumimaro Konoe, the 50-year-old prime minister. Konoe was a prince from one of Japan's highest aristocratic families and a politician closely connected to the throne. He believed in Japan's imperial destiny, but he also feared, as many around him understood, that a war with America would destroy the nation. Konoe reached out to Washington and requested a face-to-face meeting with President Roosevelt. He would fly to Honolulu or to Alaska or to any place the Americans chose. His message reached Secretary of State Cordell Hull, 70 years old, a former judge from rural Tennessee, a man of unbending principle who had watched Japan invade Manchuria, invade China, and slaughter civilians in Nanking. He was not inclined to trust Japanese assurances. Roosevelt was open to a summit in principle, but Hull insisted that the two governments first agree on the fundamental issues that could make or break it. Above all, China, Indochina, and the Tripartite Pact. And Konoe could not guarantee that Japan's army would accept the concessions Washington required. The meeting never happened. At the American embassy in Tokyo, Ambassador Joseph Grew watched the situation deteriorate. He had served in Japan for nearly a decade and relied on experienced embassy officers who understood the language and political culture. Through his wife, Alice Perry, he was connected by marriage to the family of Commodore Matthew Perry, the man who had opened Japan with the black ships. History has a strange way of folding back upon itself. 10 months before the attack, Grew had transmitted a report that Japan might attempt a surprise mass attack on Pearl Harbor. The original source admitted that the plan sounded fantastic. Washington, nevertheless, circulated Grew's cable to both Army and Navy intelligence. It became one warning among many pointing toward different possible targets. 10 days before Pearl Harbor, Dr. Stanley Hornbeck, Hull's chief advisor on the Far East, sat down and wrote a memorandum for the record. In it, he used the language of a gambler. He would give 5-to-1 odds, he wrote, that America and Japan would not be at war before December 15. 3-to-1 that there would be no war before mid-January. Even money that there would be no war before March 1st. He would be proven catastrophically wrong. Back in Tokyo, Prince Konoe was running out of time. The military had given him a deadline. If negotiations did not produce results by mid-October, they would proceed with war. Konoe pleaded. He compromised, but he could not withdraw troops from all of China. That was the one line the army would not cross. On October 16, 1941, Konoe resigned. His replacement was chosen by Koichi Kido, the 52-year-old Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, and Kido made a choice that would shock everyone. He chose Hideki Tojo, the war minister and one of the cabinet's most powerful hardliners. Why would the emperor's own advisor hand power to a leading advocate of the army's position? Kido appears to have believed that only Tojo had the discipline to control the fanatical junior officers, pushing the country toward disaster. Only Tojo could obey a direct order from the emperor to seek peace. Only Tojo could look the young hotheads in the eye and say, "We will not fight," and be obeyed. Upon taking office, Tojo was summoned before the emperor. Kido delivered the message. "Return to blank paper," he said. "Try again for peace." Tojo bowed. He appointed a new foreign minister, Shigenori Togo, and instructed him to draft new proposals. Proposal A, Proposal B, terms that Japan hoped might restore the oil while preserving some part of what it had built. The diplomats Kichisaburo Nomura, 63 years old, and Saburo Kurusu, 55 years old, carried these proposals to Cordell Hull. Kurusu was married to an American woman and had American-born children. A war between the two countries would divide his own family as surely as it divided the Pacific. Proposal B, delivered on November 20th, offered a limited withdrawal from southern Indochina, but it did not end Japan's war in China. In return, Tokyo asked Washington to restore trade and supply the oil Japan urgently needed. To Hull, it was not a genuine peace offer. It was a demand that America finance Japan's continued war on China. He rejected it. On November 26, 1941, Hull handed the Japanese ambassadors his own final response. History would call it the Hull Note. It called for Japan to withdraw its military, naval, air, and police forces from China and Indochina. It called for Japan to recognize only the Chinese government of Chiang Kai-shek, and it did not lift the oil embargo. The wording was ambiguous on one crucial point. An earlier American draft had treated Manchuria separately, but that clarification disappeared from the final note. Japanese leaders therefore read the word China as potentially reaching into Manchuria as well, the territory Japan had held since 1931. That interpretation made an already painful demand feel absolutely unacceptable. But the negotiations had failed over far more than a single word. They had failed because Japan refused to give up its conquests and America refused to accept them. Nomura and Kurusu walked out of the State Department into the cold Washington evening. Kurusu would later write that he felt as though he were walking to his own funeral, because at that very moment 6 aircraft carriers were slicing through the northern Pacific in absolute silence. Their target had already been chosen. Their pilots had already been briefed. The plan became known as Operation Z, invoking the flag Admiral Togo had raised before the victory at Tsushima. For Yamamoto, the opening blow had to be decisive. A failed attack would leave Japan facing the very long war he had warned it could not win. In hidden bays along the Japanese coast, pilots trained through the fall in absolute secrecy. Pearl Harbor was only about 40 feet deep, far shallower than American planners believed modern aerial torpedoes required. Japanese engineers fitted the weapons with wooden stabilizer fins, called kyoban, and perfected a low-altitude release technique that kept them from diving into the mud. They practiced the impossible until it became routine. They did not know their target. Only their commanders knew. Kagoshima Bay had been chosen because its shape roughly mirrored a place they would soon see for real, a place called Pearl Harbor. In Honolulu, on the island of Oahu, a young man was walking through the streets with a smile on his face. He was 29 years old. His name was Takeo Yoshikawa, though in Hawaii he lived under the name Tadashi Morimura, a junior consular official at the Japanese consulate. He tracked ship movements, berthing patterns, airfields, defense routines, and the days when the harbor was most crowded, and he reported everything back to Tokyo through routine consular cables. American intelligence intercepted many of those consular messages, but the reports were not assembled into a clear warning that Pearl Harbor was the operational target, because no one believed Pearl Harbor could be attacked. That autumn, across America, life went on as it always had. In Brooklyn, boys played stickball on the streets between rows of brownstones, and the smell of Sunday roast drifted from apartment windows. In Kansas, winter wheat lay green and low beneath the cold prairie sky, sown in the fall and waiting patiently for summer harvest. In Alabama, families gathered on wooden porches after church for pitchers of sweet tea and long conversations that ran into the evening. In Chicago, streetcars rattled down State Street past window displays already decorated for Christmas. A week earlier, on November 29th, Navy had defeated Army 14-6 before a vast Philadelphia crowd at Franklin Field. In movie theaters, families watched Sergeant York and Citizen Kane. On the radio, Bing Crosby's voice filled American kitchens. Gasoline cost roughly 15 cents a gallon. A loaf of bread was about 8 cents. Life was not perfect, the Depression had left scars, but there was a quiet, ordinary peace over the country. No foreign power had struck American territory with violence on anything approaching the scale that was coming. December of 1941 would be the last month of that ordinary peace. The last month of an innocence that would not return in the lifetime of any man who saw it end. On November 26, 1941, in the remote waters of Hidokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands, 31 ships weighed anchor, 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 8 tankers, 3 submarines, the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled in the Pacific. They were called the Kido Butai. Their commander was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a cautious man, a traditional man. He carried out a mission he had accepted as his duty. The fleet turned east. For 11 days, the Kido Butai moved in strict radio silence. No transmissions that might betray their position. They refueled at sea in heavy weather, a difficult operation that tested ships and crews alike. They kept going. On the evening of December 6th, they reached their final position, 230 miles north of Oahu. At 6 o'clock in the morning on December 7, 1941, Nagumo gave the order. The first wave lifted off the carriers into a pale gray dawn, 183 aircraft. Leading them was 39-year-old Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. In Pearl Harbor, it was Sunday. 7 battleships lay along Battleship Row, the Arizona, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, the California, the Nevada, the Tennessee, the Maryland. An 8th, the Pennsylvania, rested in Dry Dock No. 1 at the Navy Yard. Nearly 100 other vessels lay at anchor around the harbor. And on the airfields across the island, hundreds of American aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip in neat, orderly rows. They had been parked that way on the direct orders of Lieutenant General Walter C. Short, the 61-year-old commander of American Army forces in Hawaii. Short feared sabotage from local residents. Aircraft clustered in the open, he reasoned, could be more easily guarded. Much of the Army's anti-aircraft ammunition was secured for protection against sabotage rather than positioned for immediate combat. 59-year-old Admiral Husband E. Kimmel commanded the Pacific Fleet. Kimmel knew Pearl Harbor was theoretically vulnerable, but the intelligence available to him pointed toward the Far East, and he judged a carrier strike on Hawaii unlikely. At 7:53 in the morning, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida looked down through the clouds and saw them. The battleships, lined up, motionless. He pressed his radio transmitter and spoke a single word 3 times. Torah, 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 Tiger, Tiger. The signal meant complete surprise achieved, but the fleet had not been placed on full alert. Warnings had appeared. About 70 minutes earlier, the destroyer USS Ward had attacked and sunk a Japanese midget submarine, attempting to enter the harbor. At Opana, 2 radar operators detected a large formation approaching from the north. They reported it, but the control officer mistook the signal for a flight of American B-17s expected that morning. Warnings had come, but no one had put them together until the sky opened. At approximately 7:55 in the morning, bombs began falling on Pearl Harbor. Torpedo bombers screamed low over the water, releasing their weapons at wave-top height. One struck the Oklahoma, then another, then another. The great battleship rolled onto her side in less than 15 minutes, trapping hundreds of men inside her overturned hull. For 2 days, rescue teams cut through the steel with acetylene torches and pneumatic hammers. 32 men were brought out alive. Hundreds of others could not be reached. Dive bombers plunged from 10,000 feet toward the airfields at Hickam, at Wheeler, at Ford Island. American aircraft, packed together as General Short had ordered, exploded in chains of fire. At the ammunition lockers, sailors and soldiers worked frantically to break the locks. Aboard the West Virginia, a 22-year-old ship's cook named Doris Miller, a young black sailor from Waco, Texas, who was not even allowed to serve in a combat role because of the color of his skin, helped move his mortally wounded captain to a less exposed position, then took over a .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun he had never been formally trained to operate. He fired it anyway, straight into the swarms of Japanese aircraft, until his ammunition was gone. For his actions that morning, Doris Miller would become the first African-American ever awarded the Navy Cross. Aboard the cruiser New Orleans, tied up at a nearby dock, a Navy chaplain named Howell Forgy walked calmly along a line of men passing anti-aircraft shells hand to hand. As a chaplain and non-combatant, he did not man a weapon. Instead, he moved along the ammunition line, encouraging the exhausted sailors with 7 words that would soon become the title of a song sung in every American home. Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. At 8:10, an armor-piercing bomb, converted from a 16-inch battleship shell, struck the forward deck of the USS Arizona. The bomb penetrated deep into the ship and set off the forward magazines. The explosion was so violent that men aboard other ships felt the shockwave in their chests. A column of fire and smoke rose 1,000 feet into the Hawaiian sky. The blast shattered her forward hull. The Arizona lifted under the force of the explosion and quickly settled to the bottom of the harbor. She took 1,177 men down with her, fathers, sons, brothers. 38 sets of brothers served aboard the Arizona that morning. 23 of those families lost brothers together. A father and son also died side by side. Some men aboard were still teenagers. The youngest name on the memorial wall belonged to a boy only 16 years old. More than 900 remain entombed within the Arizona today. A second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived shortly before 9. By now, the Americans were fighting back. Anti-aircraft fire streaked into the sky. 29 Japanese aircraft would be shot down before the attack ended, but the damage was already done. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the attack was over. Across the 2 waves, 353 Japanese aircraft had reached Oahu and taken part in the attack. Behind them, they left a harbor of burning oil and drowning men. 21 American ships sunk or damaged. Hundreds of American aircraft destroyed or damaged. 2,403 Americans dead. 1,178 wounded. Oil, thick as tar, poured from the ruptured fuel tanks and caught fire on the surface of the water. Men jumping into the harbor to escape the burning ships surfaced into a lake of flame. American Marines on the shore pulled men from the water where they could, but many they could not reach. The medical staff at the Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital worked around the clock. Nurses and doctors treated wounds they had trained for and wounds they had not. Across the continental United States, radio programs were interrupted. In countless homes where the announcement was heard, the world Americans had known ended. Fathers stopped what they were doing. Mothers reached for their sons. Millions of Americans, in that single moment, understood that their lives had just been divided into a before and an after. Before Pearl Harbor and after. If you are watching this today, and you are old enough to remember your father coming home from the Second World War, or your grandfather speaking softly of what he had seen, then you carry that Sunday afternoon in your family's blood. Your father remembered where he was standing when he heard. Your mother remembered what she was cooking. That day did not just belong to the men who died in Pearl Harbor. It belonged to every American who lived through it, and through them, it belongs to you. In the White House, President Roosevelt was in his private study, preparing to spend a quiet afternoon with his stamp collection when the telephone rang. It was Frank Knox, the Secretary of the Navy. "Mr. President," he said, "it looks as if the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor." Roosevelt shouted a single word, "No." Harry Hopkins, sitting nearby, insisted there must be some mistake. Roosevelt did not. "A surprise blow," he replied, "was exactly the kind of thing Japan might do." And in that quiet room, with his stamp albums nearby, Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood that his presidency, his nation, and the 20th century itself had just changed forever. Aboard the flagship Akagi, hundreds of miles to the north, the young pilots returned. They had crippled the American Pacific Fleet in less than 2 hours. Commander Fuchida landed his aircraft on the Akagi and hurried to make his report. Later, critics would ask why Nagumo did not launch a third strike against Pearl Harbor's fuel depots and repair yards. But no third wave had been planned. Nagumo faced damaged aircraft, rising American anti-aircraft fire, low fuel in his destroyers, an approaching night recovery, and the unanswered question that frightened him most. Where were the American aircraft carriers? They had not been in the harbor. He did not know where they were. He turned the fleet around and sailed for home. By leaving the fuel farms, the submarine base, and the repair facilities intact, Nagumo spared assets that would prove critically important in the war that followed. Destroying them might have delayed the American response. How much, no historian can say with certainty. And the American carriers he could not find were spread across the ocean. The Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. The Lexington was carrying aircraft toward Midway. The Saratoga was at San Diego. By chance and by assignment, all three had escaped the harbor. 6 months later, Enterprise would meet Nagumo's carriers again at a place called Midway, this time alongside Hornet and the hastily repaired Yorktown. In a matter of minutes on the morning of June 4, 1942, American dive bombers fatally struck Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Hiryu survived long enough to strike back and force Yorktown's abandonment. 2 days later, the Japanese submarine I-168 torpedoed the damaged carrier, and Yorktown finally sank. 4 Japanese carriers gone in a single day. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. Nagumo would survive Midway. But in July 1944, on the island of Saipan, with American forces overwhelming his position, he would take his own life. By then, 5 of the 6 carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor were already gone. Only Zuikaku remained. She would be sunk that October at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. In Washington, on the afternoon of December 7th, Secretary of State Cordell Hull was still in his office when the 2 Japanese ambassadors arrived, Nomura, Kurusu. They had come to deliver Japan's formal reply to the Hull note. Because of coding delays at the Japanese embassy, they arrived more than an hour late. By the time they entered Hull's office, the bombs had already been falling on Pearl Harbor for over an hour. Hull already knew. He took their document. He read it in silence. Then he looked up at the 2 aging diplomats and spoke. "In all my 50 years of public service," he said, "I have never seen a document so crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions." Kurusu walked out of the State Department into the winter dusk. He would spend the rest of the war in Japan. His American-born son, Ryo, who had chosen to serve his father's country, would die as a Japanese test pilot in February 1945. The next day, December 8, 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress. His voice, so familiar to millions of Americans through years of fireside chats, rose steady and cold above the microphones. "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, he said, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The vote for war passed the House 388 to 1 and the Senate 82 to 0, 470 in favor, only 1 against. Her name was Jeanette Rankin, a pacifist congresswoman from Montana, the first woman ever elected to Congress. She wept as she cast her vote. She would say later that she could not bring herself to send other women's sons to die. 3 days later, Adolf Hitler made a decision the pact did not legally require of him. Germany declared war on the United States. Italy followed. The Second World War had become truly global. Isoroku Yamamoto received the news of the attack aboard the battleship Nagato in Japanese waters. There is a quote often attributed to Yamamoto in the days that followed. Whether he ever spoke it exactly is debated by historians, but it captures precisely what many close to him believed he understood in that moment. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He was right, because in the days after Pearl Harbor, recruitment offices filled beyond capacity. American men who had never held a rifle in their lives walked into recruitment centers and signed their names. Farm boys from Iowa, steel workers from Pittsburgh, fishermen from Maine, bank clerks from Denver, coal miners from West Virginia, in every state, in every town. More than 16 million Americans, men and women, would serve in uniform before the war was done. Of them, 405,399 would die. For millions of Americans who entered uniform after that day, Pearl Harbor became the defining image of why the war had to be fought. Your father may have been among them, your grandfather, your uncle. Whoever they were, wherever they served, many of them came home changed. Some spoke of what they had seen. Many did not. They came home to build the America that raised you, your schools, your neighborhoods, your quiet Sunday mornings. Factories that had made automobiles began producing tanks. Factories that had made refrigerators began producing aircraft engines. During the war, the United States commissioned more than 100 aircraft carriers of all types and produced roughly 300,000 military aircraft. The sleeping giant was awake, and the sleeping giant was angry. On April 18, 1943, 16 months after Pearl Harbor, American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese cable, revealing that Admiral Yamamoto would be flying to inspect troops in the Solomon Islands. 18 American P-38 Lightning fighters took off for the mission. 16 reached the interception area over the jungle of Bougainville. They shot his transport plane down. A Japanese search party found him the next day in the jungle, still buckled into a seat that had been thrown from the aircraft. He was 59 years old. He had predicted, from the beginning, that a long war with America would end in Japan's destruction. He lived just long enough to see his prediction begin to come true. 2 years after his death, in August 1945, atomic fire consumed the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The empire that had been born from the humiliation of Perry's black ships surrendered aboard an American battleship in Tokyo Bay. The war was over. More than 50 million people were dead. And so we return at the end to the question we began with. Why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? The simple answer, the answer taught in schoolbooks, is that Japan was aggressive and America was surprised. But the truth is more complicated and more troubling. Japan did not attack because it had no choice. Japan attacked because its leaders refused the choice they still possessed. The choice to abandon or substantially reduce their war of conquest in China, their occupation of French Indochina, and their planned advance into Southeast Asia. The oil cutoff turned that refusal into a deadline. Pearl Harbor was the gamble they chose to beat the clock. American intelligence and readiness failures helped the raid achieve surprise, but those failures did not force Japan to attack. The decision to launch the war and the responsibility for the bloodshed it caused belonged to Japan's leaders. They had launched and continued wars in which Japanese forces murdered civilians by the hundreds of thousands. They had built an empire on the corpses of Chinese women and children. They had made their choice long before Pearl Harbor. Today, in Pearl Harbor, the USS Arizona still lies at the bottom of the harbor. Oil still rises from her tanks, one drop at a time, more than 80 years later. If you visit her memorial, you will stand above her broken hull and you will see her names carved in white marble on the far wall. 1,177 names. Read them slowly. Say them out loud if you can, because these were American boys. They were somebody's sons, somebody's brothers. Some were already fathers. Others would never live long enough to become one. More than 900 of them lie there still, in the warm Pacific water, underneath the flag they serve. If you had a father, a grandfather, an uncle who fought in the Second World War, then somewhere in your family history, there is a thread that runs back to that morning. They came home to build the country that gave you your childhood, your schools, your neighborhoods, your quiet Sunday mornings. We owe them everything, and the least we owe them is to remember. May we never forget them. May we always be worthy of them. And may we tell their story and the story of how it began to every generation that comes after us, so that no American boy ever again wakes up in a harbor at dawn to the sound of engines he does not recognize. And no American mother ever again learns, from the tight voice of an announcer on a Sunday afternoon radio, that her son will not be coming home. That is the real reason Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and that is why we must never forget